Okay, here is the reformatted and slightly elaborated narrative based on your provided text, aiming for the specified length and style, maintaining the core story voice and formatting requests. Hey guys, tonight we're pulling anchor hoisting sails and heading way north. You know that feeling when the world feels huge and cold? Maybe you just stepped outside and realized winter is serious business? Or perhaps you're snug under a blanket, listening to a distant wind rattle the window. Imagine that, but scaled up to the size of a continent wrapped in ice, where the sun barely whispers over the horizon for months, and the silence is so deep, it feels like it has weight. Tonight we're setting off on a journey into those vast, unforgiving spaces, guided by ambition, curiosity, and just maybe a little bit of madness. This is a story wrapped inside another story, a confession wrestled from the jaws of death in a place where living itself seems like a cruel joke. You probably won't survive reading about this trip without needing an extra blanket, or questioning some life choices about pursuing goals at any cost. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, imagine you are there shivering, maybe squinting at the endless glaring white horizon. You are Robert Walton, captain of a ship, and right now your greatest companion is your pen scrawling out letters to your sister Margaret Saville back in England. You're driven by this fierce, burning ambition. You want to explore the uncharted territories of the North Pole. For you, it's the ultimate quest, the last frontier of geographic knowledge, maybe even a path to discovering some incredible secret of nature, perhaps even magnetic north, or the very origins of icebergs, who knows. Spoiler, mostly just cold and disappointment, sorry. It's the late 18th century, an age still obsessed with discovery where voyages of exploration are the viral YouTube channels of the day, and you're determined to be the one to capture that elusive North Pole view count. You've inherited a good fortune. Thankfully, sponsoring your own doomed adventure isn't cheap, and spent years preparing, studying math, physics, medicine, because you know scurvy is not the kind of content boost you want. You hired a ship, gathered a crew, who honestly must have thought you were wild, packing them off towards literally the end of the world. I mean, think about planning a trip somewhere notoriously difficult and barren, like camping but permanently and with no trees. The air is frigid, biting at your exposed skin, stealing your breath. You detail all this to Margaret, painting a picture of vast solitude, describing ice formations like jagged crystal palaces under a perpetually low sun. It's beautiful in a terrifying, this is where nature reminds you you're insignificant kind of way. You confess to her that you crave a companion, a kindred spirit who shares your fiery passion and romantic view of life, someone to talk to besides gruff sailors who probably just want their rum and not to die frozen into a human ice sculpture. This whole quest is fueled by an idea popular among geographers of the era of the open polar sea. The theory went that beyond the impassable, thick coastal ice you initially encounter, there must be a navigable open sea surrounding the pole itself. Think of it as the ultimate shortcut, or maybe just a delightfully temperate polar paradise waiting for explorers. This belief, a genuinely mainstream historical idea at the time, drove many real-life explorers towards danger and often failure, much like subscribing to get-rich-quick schemes today, but with frostbite instead of just losing $10. Historians still argue whether this open sea theory was genuinely considered sound science or more of a hopeful rationalization for the risks involved. Either way, you've bought into it completely. Months pass, marked only by the subtle shifts in the brutal light and the grinding sounds of the ice. Your letters chronicle the slow progress, the rising excitement, the inevitable frustrations. And then things get weird. Your ship is icebound, trapped. It's the Arctic's way of saying, "Nice try now, sit and think about what you've done." But then, amidst the desolation, you see something impossible. A gigantic figure, inhumanly tall, driving a dog sled across the ice northwards. You and your crew are understandably bewildered. What is that? Who is crazy enough to be up here even further north than your stuck ship and look like they belong on a very poorly photoshopped postcard? This is a genuine wait, pause, did we just see that moment in the narrative? 24 hours later, things get even stranger. Your crew rescues a man. He's weak, frozen, starving adrift on an ice floe. But get this, he's European, educated, refined. Everything Walton dreamt of in a companion. This isn't some rugged explorer type. He's a gentleman wasting away. He asks before he'll even come fully on board, "Are you traveling northwards?" Like it's the only thing that matters. When you say yes, he agrees to be brought aboard, though he looks like he's actively regretting every life choice that led him to this moment. You tend to him, nurse him back to health, captivated by his intensity and sorrow. His name, he eventually tells you, is Victor Frankenstein. He is clearly on a mission, or fleeing from one. This rescue, this chance encounter in the middle of nowhere, shifts the entire focus of your expedition. Suddenly, the North Pole seems less interesting than the story this dying man carries. You feel an immediate bond with him, recognizing a similar intensity and passion that you felt in your own breast. But in him it seems shattered, replaced by an overwhelming grief and guilt. You pour out your soul to this stranger in your letters to Margaret, describing how you finally feel you have that bosom friend you craved, even if he's tragically broken. There's this quirky historical tidbit: during expeditions like this, supplies were a huge issue, obviously. Sometimes to lighten the load, dogs that pulled sleds or served as companions would be killed and eaten if supplies ran too low. A real sympathy for the dog moment that thankfully isn't happening on Walton's ship yet, but gives you a flavor of the extremity of these ventures. You assure Margaret you'll continue writing, promising to share the incredible tale Frankenstein is beginning to tell you piece by agonizing piece. So there you are, battered and frail, propped up in Walton's cabin, surrounded by the biting cold outside and the earnest warmth of your rescuer within. You start to tell your story, unburdening a soul clearly heavy with unspoken horrors. You explain that your life began in Geneva, that most picturesque city tucked against Lake Geneva, where life for you, Victor Frankenstein, was essentially a fairy tale. Your father, Alphonse, was a kind, upright citizen involved in public affairs, though mostly you remember him for his unwavering love and quiet dignity. Your mother, Caroline, was even more central to this picture of domestic bliss. She was the daughter of one of your father's friends, left orphaned, whom Alphonse took in, and eventually married. A story romantic enough to make even the gruffest sailor shed a tear. Caroline was tenderness personified, dedicated wholly to her children and acts of charity. It's the kind of childhood that sounds too good to be true, almost like someone photoshopped all the bad parts out. And then there's Elizabeth Lavenza. Ah, Elizabeth. You tell Walton how your mother discovered her on a trip to Italy, a little orphan living with a poor family, looking like an angel fallen to earth, fairer and more serene than any child they'd seen. Caroline essentially gave Elizabeth to you as a special present, your perfect playmate, your sister, your everything. You took this to heart, viewing her from that moment on as uniquely, undeniably yours, something beautiful and sacred to protect. Their bond, the foundation of your early life, is described with such heartfelt devotion. It makes the later events even more gutting. This deep, almost obsessive attachment to Elizabeth set a pattern for how you perceived intense connections. And finally, there's Henry Clerval. your dearest friend in Geneva, a kindred spirit, who shared your love for tales of chivalry and heroism, more into moral and historical studies than the hard sciences you eventually fell for. It sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Days filled with love learning picturesque Swiss landscapes. The kind of childhood influencers today could only dream of, complete with mandatory, wholesome family activities. But even in paradise, a curious mind starts poking at the edges. Your early intellectual curiosity was, let's just say, a little outdated. Instead of focusing on the cutting-edge science of the day, you were drawn to the works of the ancient alchemists, Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, Albertus Magnus. You were fascinated by their grand mystical ambitions, the transmutation of metals into gold, the discovery of an elixir of life unlocking the deepest secrets of nature through arcane rituals and philosophical musings. You devoured these texts with the innocent enthusiasm only a bright kid with unchecked access to dusty books could have, much to the bemused disapproval of your more pragmatically minded father. He tried to gently steer you towards modern thinkers, but honestly, who needs logic when you've got theories about sympathetic magic and philosopher's stones? Turns out you kinda do. Historians still argue whether these alchemical traditions represented a legitimate precursor to modern chemistry, or were largely superstitious dead ends. You at the time firmly believed they held the keys to everything. Then came the thunderstorm. A truly pivotal moment. Watching the sheer terrifying power of nature, you saw a tree obliterated by a bolt of lightning. And after the storm, a family friend happened to explain the principles of electricity, showing you the incredible destructive and constructive power it held. This was your introduction to modern natural philosophy, and it blew your youthful alchemy-filled mind. Suddenly, Agrippa and his ilk seemed dusty and ineffective compared to this raw, visible force that could shatter trees. It ignited a different kind of fire within you, a desire to understand the fundamental forces of the universe to manipulate that power you'd witnessed. It was like upgrading from a magic wand made of sticks to a Tesla coil. Definitely more spark. Your parents, keen to encourage your intellectual development despite your brief misguided dalliance with proto-science, decided it was time for you to go to university. The obvious choice for serious study in the German states was Ingolstadt, renowned for its academic rigor. It was a decision made with the best intentions, aiming to polish your talents and prepare you for a life of significance. Saying goodbye was wrenching. Leaving your safe harbor in Geneva, your beloved Elizabeth, and the comforting companionship of Clerval, felt like stepping into a different world entirely. You arrived in Ingolstadt filled with a mix of anticipation and profound loneliness. The university town felt strange, the faces unfamiliar, and the vast halls of learning seemed cold and imposing after the warmth of your home. Your first encounter with a prominent academic was discouraging, to say the least. Professor Krempe, a professor of natural philosophy, was a little squat man with a gruff manner. You eagerly told him about your studies in Agrippa and Paracelsus, probably with stars in your eyes. He listened for about 2 seconds before unleashing a torrent of contempt. He dismissed your cherished authors as sad trash, and basically told you you'd wasted your time studying absolute nonsense. While harsh, he also pointed you towards modern science, implicitly acknowledging you might not be a complete lost cause, just severely misinformed. This felt like a punch to the gut. Your foundational intellectual heroes reduced to footnotes for losers. But Krempe in his brusque way served as the cold shower you needed. However, your next meeting offered a lifeline. You attended lectures by Professor Waldman, the chemistry professor. Waldman was a different sort, kind, eloquent, with a dignified presence. He lectured on the true principles of modern chemistry, acknowledging the historical role of earlier philosophers, a subtle nod that saved your bruised ego after Krempe, but championing the incredible power of contemporary experimental science. He spoke with intoxicating passion about the potential of chemistry to unravel the deepest mysteries of life itself. He noted your obvious intensity and raw potential. This is where your trajectory fundamentally shifted. Waldman's words, coupled with his gracious encouragement, flipped a switch. The potential he described. Understanding life, recreating nature's most profound processes, resonated deeply, perhaps linking back unconsciously to your alchemical dreams of an elixir, but now framed within the rigorous, demonstrable world of real science. A quirky fringe tidbit: alchemists were also often involved in early pharmacy and medicine. Their labs were precursors to modern chemical labs, messy, smelly, and sometimes explosive. So while their theories were often wild, the practical skills were developing, just perhaps not the right goals. You dove headfirst into your studies, devouring chemistry, biology, anatomy, with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. So Professor Waldman unlocked something fierce within you. Forget medieval alchemy and its vague pronouncements. This was modern science, promising control over nature itself. You didn't just dabble. You dove headfirst, abandoning all other pursuits. Logic and study became your sole obsession. Everything else faded. Your father's gentle letters, your mother's affectionate concern, the impending arrival of your friend Clerval in Ingolstadt. They barely registered through the haze of formulas and chemical processes. Your passion, once spread thinly across various studies, now narrowed to an intense burning beam, focusing solely on natural philosophy, and within that chemistry, and within that, the deepest, most perplexing questions surrounding the principle of life itself. You immersed yourself in anatomical studies. Now imagine this: it's the late 18th century, maybe early 19th in this novel's time frame. Medical knowledge is growing fast, fueled by increased demand for surgeons and doctors. But there's a massive practical hurdle. Dissection, while gaining acceptance, was still a sensitive topic, and legally obtained cadavers were few and far between. This is a period when, factually speaking, demand for bodies was so high that it fueled a grim trade carried out by resurrectionists or body snatchers who dug up recently buried corpses for sale to anatomists. Your research would almost certainly have brought you into contact directly or indirectly with this dark underside of scientific progress. You spent hours in dissecting rooms, witnessing the process of decay, tracing the intricate pathways of blood vessels and nerves, studying death to understand life. It sounds utterly delightful, right? Like spending your afternoons at a zombie convention, only the zombies are real and stationary. You saw death in its most raw, visceral form, observing how life departs, how flesh fails, how vitality drains away. This constant exposure desensitized you probably more quickly and more thoroughly than was healthy for a sensitive young man from a sheltered background. The horrors you witnessed, the natural decomposition, the stillness of death. Instead of repelling you, they somehow focused your purpose. You stared into the abyss, and instead of blinking, you started taking notes. You began to contemplate the root cause of life, the spark that animates clay. What was that essential energy, that driving force? Through tireless experimentation, countless sleepless nights hunched over your lab equipment, you began to discern a possibility, a horrifying, exhilarating pathway. It wasn't about transmuting lead or finding immortality in a potion. It was simpler, more profound, and infinitely more dangerous. You found that you could potentially infuse inanimate matter with this spark. You discovered the means of imparting life. It wasn't magic. It was an application of chemistry and anatomy, a terrible knowledge gleaned from studying both creation and corruption. You realized you held the key to unlocking nature's deepest secret. And the immediate thought wasn't, "Oh my God, maybe I shouldn't," but "I must do this." Driven by ambition, the sheer intellectual thrill of the discovery, and perhaps a dose of pure scientific hubris, you decided to create a being of your own making. You rationalized this monumental godlike act. You saw it as overcoming death itself, as unlocking mysteries that had eluded humanity for centuries. You pictured creating a new race who would owe their existence to you, their father. This act, you told yourself, would revolutionize science, bring glory to your name, and fundamentally change humanity's understanding of life and death. It all sounded very noble and world-changing in your head, neatly sidestepping the minor detail of assembling the parts. It's a classic example of the "but could I" overriding the "but should I," which honestly is the premise for about half the disastrous experiments in history. Just replace unethical body assembly with, say, launching a pig into space. Yes, that happened. Quirky history tidbit: France sent a pig, duck, and rooster on the first hot air balloon flight. Pioneers. Now, bringing something to life is one thing. Building it is another. This wasn't like assembling flat-pack furniture. Thank goodness. Imagine losing the instruction manual for this. You decided it would be easier to work on a large scale, maybe hoping for less fiddly bits, choosing a form roughly the size of a human being, maybe a little larger to make intricate assembly less painful, less frustrating. You decided on a size of around 8 feet tall. This wasn't just a biological puzzle. It was a logistical and, frankly, a grisly one. To gather the materials required for an 8-foot-tall animated being, you needed body parts. Lots of them. You describe in hushed tones frequenting dissection rooms, slaughterhouses, and, yes, cemeteries. Your nights were spent in gruesome places, robbing graves ethically questionable just a tad, or lurking in chilling charnel houses, sorting through decaying organic matter. You became intimately familiar with death in its most repulsive forms. This required an intense level of dedication, isolation, and emotional hardening. You rented a secluded apartment, turning one room into a laboratory and workshop, essentially a single-person high-stakes horror movie set. Here, shielded from prying eyes and the judgments of polite society, or anyone really who didn't spend their weekends rummaging through anatomical discards, you dedicated yourself entirely to your monstrous task. The process was long, arduous, and physically draining. You stitched together bones, muscles, and organs with tireless, morbid concentration. You ignored your health. Your meals became irregular. Your sleep was almost non-existent. Your skin stretched taut over your features. Your eyes became bloodshot and strained, haunted by the macabre nature of your work. You lost all touch with your friends and family, replying vaguely to letters, if at all, inventing flimsy excuses for your isolation. Your apartment, your work, became your entire world, smelling faintly or strongly of decay and chemicals. It was an absolute immersion, sacrificing every aspect of normal human life for the singular, terrible goal bubbling in your lab. It's fascinating how such an act requiring intricate physical dexterity also needed such profound intellectual effort. It really makes you wonder. Historians still argue whether the rapid advancements in anatomy and understanding of electricity in this period directly fueled popular anxieties about the boundaries between life and death, perhaps inspiring creative works like your story. It was a period ripe with both incredible progress and deep-seated fears. Okay, so for months your world shrunk to the dimensions of that single isolated workshop room, smelling like, well, let's just say not like a Yankee Candle store. You pushed your mind and body past their limits, sustained only by this relentless drive. Sleep was a rumor you'd heard about. Socializing. Apparently that was a thing people did outside your morbid little bubble. But you were closing in, nearing the completion of your terrible task. You carefully selected the final components, meticulously positioned the complex array of wires, conduits, and mechanisms needed to conduct the energy, the spark you intended to use. You waited for the opportune moment, likely a night of a fierce thunderstorm, because nature's raw power felt appropriate, didn't it? You were playing God, so why not use his lightning? It was a dreary, oppressive night in November. The rain beat against the window panes of your apartment like a frantic, watery drummer, and the wind howled a mournful tune around the eaves. The lamp in your lab cast long, flickering shadows, making the inert figure lying before you seem to twitch with phantom life. The air was thick with anticipation, and the smell of chemicals, and maybe also regret, though you wouldn't admit that yet. For weeks, this final stage had been excruciatingly tense, demanding ultimate focus. And now the moment had arrived. Historians still argue whether the prevailing scientific theory at the time leaned more towards vitalism, the idea that life possessed a non-physical spark, or essence or mechanism, viewing living beings as complex machines governable by physical laws. You, Victor, seem to be attempting a very physical mechanical application to achieve that elusive spark. With trembling hands probably fueled by nothing but bad coffee and sheer nerve, you completed the final steps. You manipulated the apparatus preparing to unleash the power needed. The tension in the air crackled, mirroring the storm outside. There was a hum, a building energy in the room. Your creation lay lifeless and passive beneath your gaze. Stitched together human pieces assembled and infused with something that looked, well, not like your idealized vision. You'd picked parts for their beauty individually, luminous eyes, shapely limbs, but put together on that gargantuan scale with sallow skin stretched tight over visible musculature and veins, it looked monstrous, hideous. Then it happened. With a surge of power, described simply but terrifyingly, you succeeded. The spark took. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. That's how you describe it. And it lived. Those luminous eyes, the very feature you thought would be beautiful, opened. They fixed upon you with a gaze that wasn't filled with the gratitude or filial love you'd optimistically dreamed of. No. It was a look of vague recognition, perhaps, but also confusion, and from your perspective, horror. It drew breath. Its limbs began to move slowly, awkwardly. Maybe a grotesque twitch here, a halting movement there. The muscles you'd so carefully constructed flexed unnaturally. Your reaction wasn't elation, relief, or scientific triumph. It was pure, unadulterated horror. The beauty you had anticipated was non-existent. The reality was grotesque. The effort of bringing it to life hadn't transformed it into an angelic being, but simply animated the disturbing raw materials. Breathless horror and disgust filled my heart, you recall. You described stumbling out of the room, abandoning your workshop, the very place that had been your world for months, as if fleeing a literal nightmare. You ran to your bedroom, tried to sleep, but your mind wouldn't let you. Every sound, every rustle in the night sent jolts of fear through you. Your sleep, when it finally came, wasn't restful. It was a torment of nightmares. You dreamt of Elizabeth, not her living form, but as you were about to embrace her, she transformed in your arms, taking on the pallid, death-like hue of your mother's corpse, and you saw the features of your creature superimposed onto hers, maggots crawling in her burial shroud. Seriously, talk about messed up subconscious material. This nightmare wasn't just a bad dream. It was a direct confrontation with the consequences of your unnatural act, uniting creation and decay, life and death, beauty and horror, and seeing your beloved Elizabeth caught in the terrible crossfire. You woke from this nightmare to find the creature standing over your bed, a shroud of bedclothes covering you, its horrifying yellow eye fixed on you. It reached out a hand, maybe seeking contact, maybe trying to communicate, but all you could see was the monster, the culmination of your dark obsession. In a blind panic, you fled again, racing through the streets of Ingolstadt, completely abandoning your creation to its fate in that apartment. You just ran, driven by primal fear, not thinking about what you had unleashed. You spent the rest of the night wandering aimlessly, a wreck of nerves, until you saw, with overwhelming relief, a carriage arriving. And out of that carriage stepped your dear friend Henry Clerval, who had finally come to join you at university. Seeing a familiar, friendly, and normal face after months of gruesome isolation, and the shock of the creation was like finding water in a desert. You practically collapsed into his arms. It was genuinely terrible timing for Henry, bless his heart, showing up just as you're having an epic meltdown. He had no idea, of course, of the horrors you'd been up to. He saw a friend wasted away by illness, consumed by something he couldn't comprehend. This is a slightly dark joke, but considering the times, maybe you were just having a bad case of Ingolstadt fever. It definitely felt like one. Seeing Henry safe and oblivious brought home just how much you had sacrificed and lost. You tried to compose yourself, greeting him with forced cheer, but your inner turmoil was too great. As Clerval began talking about his travel, his family, his excitement for studying here, his healthy, normal life, the contrast with your own existence dominated by grave-robbing laboratory experiments and monstrous animation became unbearable. The sheer shock of seeing Henry combined with months of horrific work and recent terror completely shattered you. You, Victor, immediately fell into a violent, protracted fever. For several months you were delirious, raving incoherently about your monster, about the horrors you'd witnessed, completely unintelligible to poor patient Henry, who sat by your bedside day after day nursing you back to health with unwavering kindness and concern. He saw your illness as stemming from intense study and confinement, attributing it to your overzealous pursuit of natural philosophy, which honestly wasn't entirely wrong, just a catastrophic understatement. He saved your life, tending to you with the devotion only a truly selfless friend could offer. He brought you books of poetry, talked to you of cheerful, mundane things, patiently waited for your sanity to return. Historians still argue whether fevers like the one you experienced were primarily psychological manifestations of guilt and trauma, or genuine physical ailments brought on by neglect and poor conditions. The mind-body connection was understood differently back then. What's clear is that you were completely incapacitated, your fevered brain torturing you even while you slept, trapping you in the loop of your own terrible creation. Slowly, agonizingly, you recovered. As you regained strength and lucidity, you finally took in Clerval's presence fully. His unwavering friendship, the purity of his character, were a stark contrast to the corruption and death that had filled your world. You felt a surge of gratitude, but also a renewed biting guilt. You had dragged this innocent, bright spirit into your orbit just as you were spiraling out of control. Henry, meanwhile, had patiently deferred his own studies, waiting for you, planning cheerful itineraries like learning the Oriental languages together. Your initial attempts to resume a normal student life felt hollow, tainted by the secret you carried. You avoided your old lab like the plague, shuddering at the mere thought of it. Just as you were finding your footing again, attempting a semblance of normalcy, you received a letter. It was from your father, bearing the most tragic news imaginable. Your youngest brother, dear little William, had been murdered, strangled, and a valuable miniature portrait your mother had worn around her neck, a picture of herself which William had been carrying, was gone. The details were sparse in the initial letter, only the devastating fact of his death. Your bright, innocent little brother taken so brutally. It felt impossible. You remembered his playful spirit, his childish joys, everything innocent and pure in the world. His death ripped a gaping hole in the perfect tapestry of your Geneva home. This news immediately compelled you to return home. Leaving Ingolstadt, your tainted academic pursuits, your recovering health, everything else paled in comparison to this tragedy. Henry, of course, offered to accompany you part of the way, a testament to his friendship. But eventually you parted ways, beginning the journey back to Switzerland alone. The travel itself was a somber blur. You moved through familiar landscapes, the Rhine riverbanks, the distant sight of mountains, but saw them through the filter of grief and foreboding. Every mile closer to Geneva felt like stepping back into a scene of devastation. You thought constantly of William, of your father's sorrow, of Elizabeth, who was undoubtedly distraught. She adored William. As you neared Geneva, the late afternoon light faded, giving way to the familiar, imposing shadow of the surrounding mountains. A terrible storm gathered. The kind of storm that feels personal, violent flashes of lightning illuminating the angry sky. Thunder rattling the very ground beneath you. You paused just outside the city walls, near the spot where William's body had been found, compelled by a morbid curiosity, or perhaps an unconscious dread. And there, in a vivid flash of lightning during the tempest, you saw it. Moving through the trees near the crime scene, undeniably, unmistakably the creature. Your creature. 8 feet tall, its grotesque form silhouetted against the electric light. Your heart froze. You knew instantly with terrible certainty. He had killed William. The realization struck you like a physical blow. Not only had your creation survived, but it had turned violent, committed murder, and its first victim was your own beloved brother. The monstrous life you had unleashed into the world had immediately struck at your own family. It felt like a grotesque karmic punishment. You stood stunned and paralyzed as the creature moved away and vanished into the stormy night. This eerie synchronicity of a natural storm with the appearance of your monstrous creation during this devastating personal moment makes you wonder if Mary Shelley, like many artists, was tapping into contemporary cultural anxieties. For example, quirky tidbit time anxieties surrounding the rise of artificial intelligence or robotics feel surprisingly similar to anxieties about creating artificial life in your time, don't they? There's a timeless fear of inventions turning against their creators. You entered Geneva in a daze filled with this horrific knowledge that you couldn't possibly articulate to anyone. The news of William's murder was the sole topic of conversation. Grief hung heavy over the city. You learned more details, how William had gone out for a walk and never returned, the search, the discovery of his body, the missing locket. Then you heard the unbelievable accusation Justine Moritz had been arrested and charged with the murder. Justine, the kind, gentle young woman who lived with your family as a servant, but was practically considered one of your own. So devoted to your mother, she nursed her in her final illness. It was unthinkable. She was gentle, pious, loved by the whole family. But circumstantial evidence had mounted against her. The missing locket containing the portrait of your mother had been discovered hidden in the pocket of Justine's dress. Nobody could explain how it got there, and in the absence of any other suspects or motives that the community could grasp, this piece of evidence became damning. Public opinion, driven by fear and sorrow over William's death, swiftly turned against her. The weight of suspicion combined with her distress and inability to provide a convincing alibi. She had been searching for William too, but her timings were vague, sealed her fate. You saw your beloved Elizabeth already broken by William's death, tormented by worry and fierce loyalty towards Justine. She was convinced of Justine's innocence and tried desperately to argue against the growing consensus. Your father, though saddened, seemed more resigned to the terrible undeniable in his view facts, and through it all, you remained silent. You held the awful truth inside a burning secret. You knew who the real killer was. You had created the instrument of death. You could speak out, reveal that the monster exists, that it is the true culprit. But the thought was paralyzing. How could you tell this unbelievable story? Who would believe you? You imagined the skepticism, the accusations of madness. You dreaded revealing your horrifying secret, admitting that you, Victor Frankenstein, had unleashed this horror upon the world. The consequences for yourself, reputation, freedom, maybe even your own sanity, seemed too great a risk. So you said nothing, trapping yourself in a cage of guilt and fear, allowing an innocent woman to bear the consequences of your creation's act, an act which was ultimately a consequence of your act. The injustice was excruciating. You were drowning in silent guilt. William was dead, and Justine, an innocent woman you deeply cared for, was convicted of his murder, a consequence you directly facilitated through your terrified silence. The trial itself was a farce, a travesty of justice driven by fear and flimsy circumstantial evidence. You sat there present in the courtroom, a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy, knowing the truth that could save her, but paralyzed by fear and the weight of your secret. Justine, in her despair, ultimately confessed under duress, urged by a harsh clergyman to clear her conscience and trust in heavenly mercy, sealing her own fate despite maintaining her innocence to those who would listen. It was agonizing to watch Elizabeth's desperate, heartbroken defense fail against the tide of suspicion. Justine was condemned. The thought of her execution was unbearable. The night before she was due to be hanged, you managed to see her. She maintained her serene innocence to the end, confiding her despair and disbelief at the turn of events, acknowledging her faith, but expressing profound sorrow and resentment at the injustice. She didn't ask for grand pronouncements. She just couldn't fathom why this had happened to her, a kind and blameless person. Meeting her eyes, knowing her fate was in part your doing, intensified your agony. Her death was a crushing blow to your family, and another dark mark on your soul. The picturesque Geneva of your childhood was now haunted by the ghosts of the innocent dead stained by the monster you had unleashed. This double tragedy, William's death and Justine's execution, plunged you deeper into despair. Geneva, your beloved home, felt oppressive and suffocating, saturated with sorrow and grim reminders. The presence of your father, trying to be strong but clearly heartbroken, and Elizabeth, grief-stricken and hollowed out by the loss and injustice, added to your torment. You saw the reflection of your disaster in their suffering, feeling personally responsible for every tear shed, every moment of anguish they endured. Your father, observing your profound distress, attributed it solely to grief for William and Justine. He urged you to find solace, to reconnect with nature, believing the restorative power of the Swiss Alps could heal your fractured spirit. Following his advice, partly out of filial duty, and partly out of a desperate need to escape the stifling atmosphere of home and your own dark thoughts, you decided to travel. Your destination, the valley of Chamonix, nestled at the foot of the majestic Mont Blanc. It's a region of awe-inspiring natural beauty, soaring snow-capped peaks, cascading waterfalls, expansive glaciers. Factually speaking, Chamonix was just starting to gain prominence as a destination for early mountaineers and tourists seeking the sublime spectacle of untouched nature. It was a frontier of romantic sensibility where people went specifically to be overwhelmed by the grandeur and terrifying power of the natural world. You hoped that immersing yourself in this raw, untamed environment might provide a catharsis, a purification from the horrors that clung to you. It felt like maybe, just maybe, nature's scale and indifference could somehow dwarf your own terrible deeds, putting them in perspective or even helping you forget. Spoiler, doesn't work that way. The journey to Chamonix was emotionally arduous. You traveled through scenes of serene pastoral beauty that only heightened your sense of desolation and internal ugliness. Reaching the valley felt like entering a different realm. Mont Blanc dominated the landscape, a silent, massive presence, ancient and indifferent to human suffering. You wandered through the valley, drawn to its wildest parts. You visited the Glacier des Bossons, a river of ice grinding slowly down the mountainside, its jagged crystalline surface hinting at immense hidden power. It was breathtaking, terrifying, and deeply solitary. You contemplated the incredible force required to form and move such vast bodies of ice. It mirrored, in a disturbing way, the uncontrollable force you had brought into the world. It felt like walking on the slow-moving, frozen heartbeat of the world itself. It's almost comical in a grim way, how you chose the one kind of scenery that could possibly feel colder and more isolated than the Arctic Walton found you in peak performance, in unintentional self-torture. Days blurred into a sequence of restless wandering and crushing introspection. The beauty of Chamonix couldn't erase the nightmares that plagued your sleep, or the ever-present guilt that was your waking companion. You felt hunted perpetually on edge, knowing that your creation was out there, somewhere, perhaps seeking you out, perhaps causing further havoc. The secrecy surrounding your monster was an unbearable burden. You knew that admitting the truth even now carried immense risks. Who would believe you? How would you explain unleashing such a creature? Your reputation, your sanity, everything could be called into question, and yet maintaining silence felt complicit, leaving you responsible for any further atrocities the monster might commit. One particularly bleak, overcast day, seeking yet deeper solitude and escape, you decided to climb the Salave, a peak overlooking Geneva. As you ascended, the mist rolled in, enveloping the landscape in a damp gray shroud. It felt fitting, hidden from the world just as your terrible secret was hidden. When you reached the summit, the mist parted slightly, and then you saw it. On the rocks not far from you stood a figure. It was tall, immense, moving with preternatural speed and agility. There was no mistaking it. It was your creature. You knew with a sick certainty that turned your blood to ice that this was no coincidence. It had found you. You were standing quite literally face to face with your responsibility on a lonely mountaintop far from anyone who could help. Talk about a truly awkward family reunion. Historians still argue whether Romantic-era depictions of nature, particularly sublime landscapes, like those in the Alps, primarily reflected humanity's potential for greatness, or their inherent insignificance and powerlessness against elemental forces. Your encounter here definitely points towards the latter, positioning you as utterly exposed and vulnerable in the face of the immense power your ambition had harnessed. Despite your immediate surge of terror and rage, something else settled over you. Perhaps it was the shock, or the overwhelming inevitability of the confrontation, or maybe a sliver of residual curiosity buried beneath the horror. The creature approached you no longer a distant silhouette, but a distinct, terrifying entity. You felt a mix of loathing, fear, and a strange, morbid curiosity. This was the being you had spent months painstakingly assembling and bringing to life, the monster responsible for the death of your brother and the execution of Justine. Now it was here on this isolated mountain peak, seeking a confrontation. Okay, deep breath. Here you are, face to face with the result of your ambition on a misty mountain. All your rage and despair finally find an outlet. You verbally lash out, damning your creature, cursing its existence, expressing the full depth of your loathing and regret. You call it a devil, a fiend, a wretch, blaming it for all the suffering it has caused, for William's death, for Justine's tragic end. You threaten it, wishing you had the power to destroy it, wishing it had never been brought into being. It's an explosion of pent-up guilt and terror directed entirely at the physical embodiment of your mistakes. You literally just went from contemplating sublime nature to having a full-blown argument with your sentient science project. Classy. But then the creature does something unexpected. It speaks. Not in grunts or roars, but in clear, articulate, even eloquent language. This must have been an extra little jolt to your system, realizing this thing is not a mindless brute, but intelligent, capable of thought and communication. The creature doesn't immediately retaliate with violence. Instead, it pleads with you. It explains calmly, despite your furious tirade, that it is miserable, profoundly lonely and wretched precisely because you have abandoned it. It tells you it craves happiness, connection, acceptance, and that its capacity for suffering is immense. It blames you for its misery, calling you its creator, and therefore obligated to provide for it, to offer it guidance, companionship, or at least understanding. It argues that its crimes are a consequence of its isolation and your rejection. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, it says, wielding powerful literary references better than some university students. It offers a deal: listen to its story, hear its experiences, and only then judge if its actions are truly evil or merely the result of intolerable circumstances forced upon it by your neglect. It says that if you listen and understand its suffering, it will leave you alone and harm no one again. If you refuse, it warns it will continue to make you miserable in retaliation for its own agony. Despite your horror and disgust, the creature's articulate speech and logical plea manage to penetrate your rage. Curiosity, a trait that has always driven you often into trouble, compels you. Maybe there's something to its story. Maybe there's an explanation. Or maybe you're just morbidly fascinated by hearing the narrative from the monster's mouth. So with immense reluctance and a knot of dread in your stomach, you agree to listen. The creature leads you off the mountain to a crude hovel in the ice cave of the Glacier des Bossons, its current lonely dwelling. You sit down shivering with a mix of cold and apprehension and prepare to hear the tale of the abandoned creature's life since that dreary November night. The creature's narration begins with its very first moments of consciousness in your laboratory. It describes a confusing swirl of sensory input, blinding light, overwhelming sounds, and a multitude of physical sensations it couldn't understand. Its awakening was not accompanied by care or explanation, but by your scream of horror and swift abandonment. Left alone in the strange, cold room, it stumbled about, clothed only in the rags you'd loosely draped over its frame, discovering its physical form in the world through painful, clumsy trial and error. It stumbled outside into the hostile, natural environment, experiencing cold, heat, hunger, thirst, things it had no prior context for. Every basic survival skill had to be learned from scratch. It recounts seeking shelter in rough woods, bewildered by the world and its own existence. One crucial early experience it details is the discovery of fire. Like early humans, fact check, the mastery of fire was indeed a fundamental step in human evolution, providing warmth, light protection from predators, and allowing for cooking. The creature encountered fire and initially found it both fascinating and painful. It learned that fire could provide warmth, but also burned if touched. It then learned to manage and utilize it after observing humans figuring out how to feed it with wood, mimicking the actions of those it saw. This illustrates its capacity for observation, learning, and adaptation. The creature was functionally intelligent, like an accelerated human infant, learning the world only 8 feet tall and terrifying to look at. This trial and error learning about fundamental elements makes you reflect your ambition created a physical being. But nature, observation, and hardship provided its education, not you. The turning point in the creature's early development came when it discovered a small hidden hovel attached to a cottage. This wasn't just a shelter. It provided a vantage point from which to observe a human family, the de Lacys. This blind old man, his daughter Agatha, and son Felix were living in quiet poverty, cultivating a small garden for sustenance. From its hiding place, your creations secretly watched them, hour after hour, day after day. This clandestine observation became its primary education in human behavior, emotions, and language. It saw their struggles, their love and support for one another, their simple kindness, and their occasional sorrows. It saw how they cared for each other, a stark contrast to the abandonment it had experienced. This watching provided a poignant, unintended education, like a strange, sad, one-way reality show. Historians still argue whether natural man untouched by society is inherently good or evil, a philosophical debate raging in the period influenced by thinkers like Rousseau. The creature in this early phase presents a strong case for being born with a potential for goodness, quickly learning empathy from observing the Delacies. Through patiently observing their interactions and listening to them speak, the creature began to understand their language. It heard their words match them to objects and feelings, painstakingly deciphering the complexities of human communication. It learned names, relationships, and the basic structure of their lives. Felix attempting to cheer up his family by educating a young foreign woman who arrives. Safi unknowingly provides the creature with a formal education. Safi is learning French using a history book, and Felix's lessons cover language, reading, writing, and even broader lessons about human history, societal structures, and ethics. So crouched in its hovel, listening intently, the creature absorbed not only language but history and morality. It learned about grand human narratives, civilizations' discoveries, and sadly about the darker aspects of humanity: cruelty, prejudice, the inequality that caused the Delacies' poverty, and the harsh judgment society inflicts upon those who are different or unfortunate. It learned about noble actions and terrible crimes. And through all this, a longing grew within its vast form, a yearning to connect with these kind people, to be accepted, to be a part of their world. It recognized the inherent human need for companionship and belonging, which your act of abandonment had completely denied it. This period of hidden observation wasn't just educational, it was emotionally formative, nurturing both its capacity for empathy and a deepening sense of its own painful isolation. It's hard to believe, sitting there on the mountain, that this monster was once just a lonely, silent learner in a hovel, essentially homeschooled by listening through a wall. A truly bizarre form of distance learning. Listening to the creature's tale unfold, you feel a complex mix of emotions: grudging respect for its learning capabilities, awe at its detailed observations, and perhaps deep down a flicker of guilt as you hear about its solitary, arduous path since your abandonment. Its time observing the Delacies wasn't just about language. It was a crash course in human emotion and society. It learned about love, sorrow, and justice, and developed a profound desire to be integrated into a community, however small. The creature saw the beauty of their family bond and craved something similar. It actively sought to cultivate kindness and gentleness within itself, inspired by their simple virtues. During its hidden studies, the creature also stumbled upon a briefcase left by one of your Ingolstadt travel companions. Inside were crucial documents: your journal detailing the process of your creation, a copy of Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, a tale of unrequited love and despair, and a volume of Plutarch's Lives, which presented examples of noble heroes and their moral struggles. Reading your journal, particularly your descriptions of its birth and your subsequent disgust and horror, was devastating. It learned the cold, brutal truth about its origins and your utter rejection, experiencing a searing pain that surpassed physical suffering. Reading Werther deepened its understanding of profound sorrow and loneliness, providing a framework for its own despair. Plutarch's heroes ironically offered examples of virtuous behavior that contrasted sharply with its own outcast existence and growing resentment. These readings provided a potent and ultimately volatile education. The creature acquired a vast vocabulary, an understanding of complex human emotions, and a knowledge of the world and its history, including its cruelties. But this knowledge, coupled with its fundamental difference and isolation, only intensified its misery. It saw what humanity could be reflected in the Delacies' kindness and Plutarch's heroes, and saw what it was: a solitary, rejected entity incapable of fitting in. Its appearance became a central, torturous point of awareness. Seeing its own reflection for the first time filled it with horror. It finally understood why it evoked such terror in others. The desire to connect with the DeLaceys grew irresistible. Convinced that his physical appearance was the primary barrier, the creature hatched a plan. It waited until Old Man DeLacy was alone, knowing the old man was blind and would therefore not recoil in horror at his appearance. He entered the cottage, beginning a conversation, speaking gently, attempting to gain sympathy by presenting himself as a miserable traveler in need of help. He appealed to the old man's compassion, hinting at his difficult circumstances and his longing for acceptance. It was a moment pregnant with desperate hope. Perhaps here, with someone who could not see, acceptance was possible. This bold step makes you reflect. This monster wasn't just reacting. It was actively trying to secure happiness and belonging, demonstrating a capacity for complex strategy and emotional intelligence. The interaction was going okay-ish until Felix, Agatha, and Safie returned. Upon seeing the creature, their reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Felix cried out, beating it with the stick, driving it from the cottage. Agatha fainted, and Safie shrieked and fled. The sight of their abject terror and violent rejection crushed any remaining hope. The creature had presented itself as eloquent and desperate for kindness, only to be met with fear and loathing purely because of its appearance. It was proof positive it was irrevocably alienated from humanity by its very form. This moment of absolute rejection was the turning point. The sweetness the creature had cultivated watching the DeLaceys curdled into bitter resentment and fury. All the pain of abandonment, the months of solitary suffering, the sting of this immediate prejudiced expulsion. It ignited a burning hatred for humanity, and for you, its creator. I am alone and miserable, the creature tells you on the mountain. You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? This rhetorical question highlights the crux of its transformation. If its own creator rejects it, how can it expect kindness from strangers driven by this white-hot rage and despair? The creature committed its first truly malevolent act. The DeLaceys, horrified by the intrusion, abandoned their cottage. In retaliation for its rejection, the creature burned the cottage to the ground, an act of vengeful destruction. It understood fire's destructive power, and it unleashed it on the symbol of the family who had unwittingly educated and then rejected it. With nowhere else to go and filled with a burning desire for vengeance against you, the creature resolved to find you. Its subsequent journey involved hardship and further painful encounters with humans, solidifying its loathing. One encounter particularly seared its soul, seeing a little girl playing alone. It felt a moment of tenderness, a desire to approach, and perhaps just maybe connect innocently. But when the girl accidentally slipped into a stream, the creature saved her from drowning. What was its reward? The man accompanying the girl, seeing the monstrous figure holding her, immediately assumed it was a threat and shot it, wounding it. This act of violence against the very entity that had just saved his child was final proof to the creature its efforts at kindness and aid would only ever be met with fear and violence. Any impulse towards benevolence was crushed under the weight of human prejudice. A genuinely peculiar, though perhaps understandable, historical tidbit. Some ancient cultures had myths of creation or powerful beings crafted or assembled from disparate parts, hinting at a primal cross-cultural fascination with the idea of artificial life, long before science made it felt remotely plausible. Your monster taps into something very ancient here. Carrying the physical and emotional wound from the shooting incident, filled with unadulterated rage and focused entirely on revenge against you, the creature made its way to Geneva, tracing your likely path home from your letters. It tells you how it discovered William near the woods and seized him. Seeing his resemblance to your portrait he was carrying and hearing the child cry out his name, Frankenstein confirmed its connection to you. A monstrous idea formed. It would deprive you of happiness as you had deprived it. It describes strangling the boy, and then upon finding Justine Moritz asleep nearby, placing the locket in her dress, recognizing in a chilling act of malice that this would implicate an innocent and thereby cause you the family it now hated even more suffering. This act of deliberate cruelty orchestrating Justine's downfall demonstrates a terrifying evolution. Rejected by empathy, the creature fully embraced malice as its tool for connection and retribution. It wanted you to suffer the same agony of loss and isolation it had endured. Its story laid bare before you on that mountain is a chronicle of creation abandonment, arduous self-education, repeated rejection, and finally transformation from potential innocence into vengeful monster. You, Victor, listening, are forced to confront the fact that while the creature committed the murders, its state, its rage, and its path towards these acts were a direct result of your actions, or rather, your profound lack of action, your terrible failure to take responsibility for the life you created. The weight of this is immense. Your silence at Justine's trial feels less like a strategic, if cowardly, choice now, and more like the logical endpoint of your original catastrophic failure to care for your creation. Sitting there on the mountain, having heard this terrible, heartbreaking confession, the full weight of your actions and inaction crashes down on you. The creature finishes its narrative detailing the suffering it endured, the reasons for its turn to violence, and the calculated malice behind William's murder and Justine's framing. Its story is a devastating indictment of your choices, laying bare the direct line between your abandonment and its crimes. You see that your ambition to create life resulted not in a grateful son or a scientific marvel, but in a profoundly miserable and subsequently dangerous being shaped by loneliness and rejection. And having poured out its soul, the creature makes its ultimate demand. It doesn't want your love or acceptance anymore. Those hopes were extinguished with the DeLacy's. It knows it is irrevocably hideous and shunned by all humanity. What it does want is a companion. Another being like itself but female, to share its exile, to understand its nature, to alleviate its unbearable solitude. It argues that only another creature of its kind could ever truly accept or understand it. With a companion, it promises it will retreat from human society forever, taking its mate to the desolate, uninhabited regions of South America, specifically mentioning jungles, which, spoiler alert, are considerably different temperature-wise from the Arctic or Alps, maybe suggesting its adaptability or just slightly shaky geography, living a harmless, isolated existence, never again troubling humanity and crucially leaving you and your family in peace. It vows this promise backed by the desperation in its plea. "You must create a female for me," it states. This demand hits you with a fresh wave of horror. Create another one. Repeat the nightmare. Your first impulse is an emphatic, absolute refusal. The very thought of replicating your catastrophic experiment is repellent. But the creature is insistent, its arguments logical from its perspective, its threat implied. Failure to comply means continued torment for you, and likely more death. It emphasizes the immense suffering it has endured and continues to face alone. It speaks with desperate eloquence, reminding you that as its creator, you owe it a measure of happiness, or at least a way to alleviate its misery. Weighing the unspeakable horror of creating another monster against the devastating certainty that your current creature will continue its path of destruction and vengeance if you refuse, you eventually, with immense reluctance and foreboding, agree. The potential consequence of refusal, the safety of your remaining loved ones, your father and Elizabeth, is too high a stake. You rationalize that granting its demand is the lesser of two evils, a horrific compromise aimed at preventing further bloodshed and securing your own peace, a somewhat self-serving goal, but understandable after everything. The creature is overjoyed, momentarily losing its terrifying aspect in a flash of what almost looks like childlike anticipation. It has hope again placed entirely in your reluctant hands. Returning to Geneva with this terrible task ahead of you is difficult. You cannot reveal the truth to your father or Elizabeth. How do you tell them you are leaving again to build another grotesque human being? You invent a pretext. You need to travel to England to pursue studies with some prominent scientists there, particularly in preparation for accompanying Henry Clerval, who is finally embarking on his own grand tour of Europe, which conveniently includes a stay in Britain. Your family, relieved to see you planning a positive academic trip, and encouraged by the thought of you being with Henry, readily agree. Elizabeth, bless her trusting heart, is just happy to see you appear to be shaking off your depression and engaging with life again, blissfully unaware you are planning a double creation-destruction event. You depart Geneva, accompanied by Henry. The contrast between you is stark. Henry is enthusiastic, eager to explore new cultures, appreciate the beauty of nature, and visit historically significant places, the ideal tourist. You, on the other hand, are consumed by your secret task, seeing the world around you through a haze of dread and planning. Every conversation about art or history is punctuated in your mind by grim anatomical checklists. Visiting London, experiencing its vibrant scientific community. It's all just background noise to the dark project looming over you. A fascinating mainstream historical tidbit here. England, especially London and Edinburgh, was a major center for medical and anatomical study in this era, albeit still grappling with issues of body procurement, reinforcing the real-world context for your ghoulish supplies. Henry delights in the trip. You view it as an agonizing delay to the inevitable. Your forced cheerfulness wears thin your true thoughts miles away in some isolated location you can use as a lab. Finally, after traveling through England and into Scotland, constantly shadowed you suspect by your creature, you manage to separate from Henry. You insist you need to work alone on a particularly sensitive scientific task, the lie getting bolder now. You head to the most remote location you can find, a desolate, tiny island in the Orkneys. Talk about going off the grid. This place is perfect for Frankenstein 2.0. Windswept, barren, isolated from civilization, it provides the perfect, miserable workshop for your second attempt at playing God. The remoteness offers physical safety, but intensifies your psychological isolation. It feels like being exiled to the edge of the world, trapped with your monstrous burden. There's a slightly unsettling quirk here. Some small remote islands actually served as leper colonies, or places to isolate people with contagious diseases historically. Again, linking isolation and difference to places of harsh, natural beauty, may be fitting for building a being deemed contagion level undesirable. Setting up a crude laboratory in a small dilapidated hut, you begin the horrific task of constructing the female creature. The process this time is even more gruesome, weighed down by the knowledge of what your success entails and fueled by reluctant necessity rather than ambitious excitement. You gather materials probably from the same kind of unsavory sources you used before, working under constant emotional duress. Doubts gnaw at you. What if the female creature isn't agreeable? What if they both reject your control? What if they procreate and create a race of monsters? Historians still argue whether the anxieties about playing God present in your story reflect primarily religious fears about defying divine order, or secular anxieties about humanity's growing scientific power outpacing its moral wisdom. You're living this debate right now, questioning the moral implications mid-gruesome assembly. Halfway through your work, consumed by these horrifying possibilities, a chilling realization hits you. The creature guaranteed they would leave humanity alone, but what proof do you have? What if the female refuses to go to South America, What if she's more malicious than the male? What if they hate each other? And the worst-case scenario, the one that sends a fresh wave of nausea through you, what if they do mate and propagate an entire race of these powerful, physically imposing, potentially vengeful beings unleashed on the world because you built them a mommy monster? The thought is paralyzing. You picture generations of grotesque beings dominating the earth. The sheer unbearable scale of this potential disaster overwhelms the desperate promise of relief for the single male creature. Just as you're wrestling with this ultimate fear, you look up. Your workshop hut has a small window. Framed in that window with an expression of malevolent joy and menacing anticipation on its face is your creature. It had followed you. It was watching you build its mate. Its eyes meet yours, filled with hope for its future companion. But your gaze is filled with sudden, absolute conviction. You cannot do this. You cannot risk creating a race of monsters. The potential catastrophe is far, far worse than the continued suffering of one being. Looking up, seeing the creature's face at the window, your decision solidifies in a rush of cold clarity. You will not unleash this potential plague on the world. The future horrors you envisioned, a race of monsters humanity enslaved or eradicated, override the promise of peace offered by satisfying the demands of this one creature. The relief he feels anticipating his mate is a knife in your gut, knowing you are about to snatch that hope away. But the risk is too immense. With a surge of desperate energy fueled by dread and resolve, you fall upon the half-finished female form in your workshop. You tear at it, ripping apart the carefully assembled limbs, destroying the complex systems you'd spent months creating. It's a furious, visceral act, undoing your own work in a desperate attempt to prevent a greater catastrophe. It feels horrifyingly final, a perverse echo of your first creation, but ending in dismemberment rather than animation. The creature sees this. He sees you dismantling his last hope of companionship and happiness. His expression at the window twists from anticipation into something far more terrifying, pure incandescent fury. His face becomes a mask of monstrous rage. You finish your destructive task quickly, probably working through sheer adrenaline. When you look up, he's gone from the window, but you hear his roar of anguish and rage from outside, a sound of profound betrayal and unleashed wrath. He enters the hut and confronts you standing amidst the strewn remains of his potential mate. He recounts his sufferings, reminds you of your promise, curses your cruelty for denying him this single comfort, this hope for an end to his isolation. His language is burning, filled with hatred and the vow of retribution. He delivers the chilling promise, the one that will echo in your ears and haunt your future. I shall be with you on your wedding night. It's not a generic threat. It's a targeted, specific promise of devastation. A threat aimed squarely at the thing you hold dearest, Elizabeth. He leaves you standing there amidst the ruins alone with the horrific realization of what you have just provoked. The immediate aftermath is chaos. You have to get rid of the evidence. The remnants of the female creature must be disposed of. It's late, maybe nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, you gather the pieces of the dismantled body and carry them in a heavy sack to the sea. Rowing a boat out into the dark, choppy waters, you drop the gruesome weight overboard, watching it sink beneath the waves, hoping this is the end of the physical remnants of your ambition. It's a grim, solitary burial at sea. As you row back exhausted and distraught, a fierce storm brews up, mirroring the tempest in your soul. You lose your oars, completely adrift in the tempestuous waters. The small boat is tossed about like a toy, your life at the mercy of the elements. You're utterly helpless, alone, being flung around by the ocean, a metaphor maybe for how little control you really have. Against all odds, the storm subsides, and you drift, eventually landing somewhere you don't recognize. When you stumble ashore, weak and disoriented, you are immediately greeted not by rescue, but suspicion. It seems a murder has recently occurred nearby, and you looking like a haunted, half-drowned maniac are the perfect suspect. The place you've landed is an unfamiliar shore, Ireland. Factually, in the 18th and 19th centuries, transportation was arduous, and news spread slowly and imperfectly. Someone arriving from a tiny remote Scottish island, having seemingly appeared from nowhere during a storm looking utterly wretched, would indeed be highly suspicious in the aftermath of a crime. Local authorities detain you and you are dragged before a magistrate. The name sounds familiar, Mr. Kerwin. He appears sympathetic but stern, determined to see justice done. Historians still argue whether the legal procedures in this era adequately protected the accused, especially those without means or clear identities, reflecting perhaps that your arrest might be distressingly easy, given your state and lack of corroborating story, and the fact your only companion for months was a terrifying monster. The accusation of murder is terrifyingly real. As the proceedings move forward, you are brought into a room to see the body of the victim, confirmation of whose life has been claimed this time. And there he lies, cold, lifeless, a purple mark of strangulation on his neck. It is Henry Clerval, your oldest, kindest friend, brutally murdered. The creature fulfilled the first part of its threat, striking at someone you loved, the purest, most innocent soul in your life, in retribution for denying him his mate. He couldn't wait until your wedding night to begin your suffering. He took Henry, who had been traveling across the mainland towards you. Seeing Henry's lifeless body, the full, sickening scale of the creature's vengeance hits you. Your scream echoes, and you collapse into another prolonged period of delirium, completely broken by this latest, most personal tragedy. Another dark joke turns out creating a monster is really, really bad for your health emotionally and physically. You lie feverish for months, raving incoherently, tended to this time by guards and Mr. Kerwin's hired nurse. Your father hears the terrible news that you are accused of murder and Clerval is dead. Despite the scandal and the geographical distance, your father immediately rushes to your side in Ireland. His arrival, his unwavering support anchors you during your slow recovery. The sight of his face, lined with grief but resolute, finally pulls you back from the brink of madness and despair. Eventually aided by the fact that witnesses can corroborate your whereabouts on the remote island at the exact time the body was found drifting towards the coast, the evidence proves insufficient. You are acquitted, judged not guilty of Henry's murder. It's a legal victory that feels utterly hollow because you know who did kill Henry. You know you are indirectly responsible. The knowledge is a suffocating weight more damning than any court judgment. You return to Geneva with your father, a shadow of your former self. The idea of peace feels impossible. Elizabeth, while relieved by your acquittal and return, is still reeling from the death of William Justine, and now Henry, and your own near-death experience. The happiness of home is shattered, forever tinged with sorrow and the unspoken dread of what the creature might do next. Despite this pervasive gloom, despite the creature's ominous wedding night threat, your father, seeing your continued despair, urges you to marry Elizabeth. This had always been the family's unspoken plan, a source of hope in brighter days. Elizabeth is ready, her love for you unwavering. The prospect fills you with both longing and terrible dread. How can you expose her to the danger that stalks you? How can you tie her fate to yours, knowing you are marked for the creature's final revenge? You vacillate, filled with internal conflict, considering whether to tell her the truth or somehow shield her. You even prepare for the wedding night, taking precautions, arming yourself, fully expecting the creature to come for you, not understanding, or perhaps suppressing the understanding of his particular brand of malice, which targets your sources of happiness. The wedding proceeds. It's a blend of joy and foreboding. Elizabeth, beautiful and radiant, sees the happiness she longed for. You see the shadow of the creature's promise. The night arrives. You send Elizabeth away to the safety of her room while you stand guard, anticipating the confrontation, weapon ready, expecting the monster to burst through the door, come for you. But the creature in its twisted brilliance doesn't want to fight you. It wants to strike at the very core of your being, destroy the final pure source of joy in your life. While you are on guard, distracted, listening for it to appear, it slips into Elizabeth's chamber. Her scream, high-pitched, full of terror, quickly cut short, is the most horrific sound you have ever heard. You rush in to find her lifeless, draped across the bed, strangled, the creature grinning at the window with an expression of triumph and cruel satisfaction, before vanishing. He didn't come for your life. He came for the life that made yours worth living. Quirky historical note: public hangings or viewing of criminals' bodies were still occasionally a practice in various places during this era, meant as a deterrent. Seeing the creature framed in the window after the murder displaying himself in triumphant wickedness has a bizarre echo of this public display of grim finality, forcing you to witness his justice. This is the breaking point. Your beloved Elizabeth, the one constant light in your life, gone. Murdered on your wedding night by your creation. Grief consumes you quickly, hardening into an unyielding resolve. Vengeance becomes your sole purpose. Your father dies soon after, unable to bear the accumulated weight of so much loss. William Justine Henry Elizabeth. He too is a casualty of your actions. Left utterly alone with nothing left to live for but the hunt, you dedicate yourself to destroying the creature. You leave Geneva armed and relentless, tracing the creature's path. The creature in a bizarre game often leaves cryptic messages or hints, seeming to want you to pursue him, drawing you on a cat playing with its mouse. Perhaps still seeking some perverse form of connection or validation, or simply wanting you to experience a fraction of the hardship he endured in hunting you. The chase takes you across Europe, through Russia, further and further north, into increasingly desolate and frozen landscapes. Your hatred and the thirst for vengeance sustain you, pushing you beyond human endurance. You pursue him into the Arctic Circle, cold, barren, mirroring the landscape where this nightmare began. It is here, in this unforgiving white wilderness, chasing your monster, exhausted, freezing, and near death, that you encounter Captain Robert Walton's ship. Your final physical breakdown happens here. Recognizing a shared obsession with exploring dangerous, isolated places, and seeing in Walton's driven ambition a reflection of your own destructive path, you pour out your confession, telling him the entire agonizing story. Your narration to Walton concludes here, leaving you weak and fading, urging him to finish your work to find and destroy the creature. Walton adds the final entries to his letters, describing your deterioration, your unwavering hatred for the creature, your dying breaths consumed by thoughts of vengeance. He recounts how shortly after your death, as Walton looks upon your lifeless body, the creature appears in your cabin. It stands over your corpse, expressing sorrow and a strange, contradictory regret. It confesses its crimes to Walton, explaining its motivations, detailing its miserable existence since birth, its constant suffering, its thwarted hopes. It defends its actions as the predictable, tragic result of abandonment and societal rejection. It acknowledges its own wickedness, but places the ultimate blame on you, its creator, for bringing it into a world where it could find no place or peace, and for then destroying its last hope of companionship. With its creator dead, the creature states it has nothing left to live for, that its task of inflicting misery is complete. It announces its intention to travel to the furthest, coldest reach of the north and build a funeral pyre for itself, ending its tormented existence. With that, it leaps from the ship and vanishes into the icy darkness, presumably to fulfill its final solitary act. And Walton, convinced and shaken by both your story and the creature's confession, is left to ponder the terrible tale surrounded by the vast, empty, silent, unforgiving landscape of the Arctic. The narration of this history, Frankenstein's tragic tale and the monster's fate, concludes with this departure into the endless ice. This is the end of the script. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We started this journey in the biting cold, adrift on an Arctic sea, seeking answers alongside Robert Walton. We've followed a path etched in ambition, discovery, creation, and a darkness that spun outwards, touching innocent lives, and ultimately consuming its architect. The chill you might feel now isn't just the lingering atmosphere of icy wastes and barren landscapes. It's the echo of profound loneliness, of consequences unintended, of a life yearned for, but never granted, and a love brutally extinguished. The shadows around you aren't quite so ominous when you remember they're just shadows, aren't they? The monster is gone, dissolved into the ice. Its tale finished. Its sorrow silenced in the white emptiness it yearned for, but dreaded. The ambition that drove Victor, the longing that drove his creature. They found their end, perhaps not the one either desired, but a stillness nonetheless. As the story settles, allow your own thoughts to drift. Release the tension held in your shoulders, the questions sparked in your mind. The chase is over. The pursuit ended long ago amidst the groaning ice floes. Now let the silence of these vast imagined spaces wash over you, quieting the anxieties they stirred. Curl a little tighter under your blankets. Feel the familiar comfort of your own bed, so unlike the charnel houses and icy caves of our story. Let the chill recede. You are safe. You are home. Breathe slowly, deeply. The stories belong to the night now. Sleep finds its way soft as falling snow.